Well, hello everyone. This is Dark Journalist with a very special Part 2 episode with some amazing revelations from Oxford scholar Dr. Joseph Farrell. Now, in Part 1, we looked at the roots of the secret space program all the way back to the Kennedy administration. Today, we'll take a deep look at how a New Orleans district attorney named Jim Garrison found himself dancing with a covert intelligence group operating deep inside the aerospace wing of the national security state. Upon further investigation, he discovered ties to post-war fascist organizations. Here we go, Dr. Joseph Farrell on Jim Garrison and the secret space program. Joseph, it's great to have you back with us for part 2 of our deep discussion on the roots of the secret space program. Now, let's pick it up here, where New Orleans DA Jim Garrison had brought criminal charges against the leader of the World Trade Center in New Orleans, a man named Clay Shaw, who was a confirmed CIA asset. Mm-hmm. Now, this was actually put on record later by a senior CIA official named Victor Marchetti. Now, that's 500 to 800 pages that are in these secret classified files. Now, they released 10 pages, 8 of which were completely redacted. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what is it about these Garrison files that is so secret and so explosive that they're still being kept under wraps 50 years later?
Well, quite literally, it was President Lyndon Johnson's murder incorporated. Mm-hmm. Because what Garrison allegedly uncovered was that all of these world trade centers and world trade marts that were being built and established around the world. There was one in New Orleans that Clay Shaw was obviously connected with. He had traced all of this back to Italy, to a company called Centro Mondiale Commerciale, again, World Trade Center.
All right.
And in turn, this he uncovered was being connected and run by an international corporation called Permindex, which is a shorthand for Permanent Industrial Expositions. That was the name of this company, and Permindex for short. And Garrison, in investigating all of this, uncovers that Centro Mondiale Commerciale, the Italian branch of it, had connections to the CIA funding of the anti-communist election funding that the CIA had sponsored during the Italian elections of 1948. That, in turn, of course, connected it to Pope Pius XII, who okays the use of these CIA funds through the Vatican Bank to the Italian opposition parties. And in other words, what he's uncovering here is this huge corporate front that basically is doing nothing but acting as a front for CIA covert operations. Mm-hmm. Now, you dig a little further into Permindex, which, Garrison does, and you discover that it's a kind of a holding company that supposedly is set up to run hotels, cruise lines, and casinos. Okay?
Wow.
And if you're Garrison and you see that, what do you think? Well, the first thing you think is mafia.
Right.
Because you've got a bunch of pissed off mafiosi right there in New Orleans that are really upset about the loss of their casino income in Castro's Cuba.
Right.
So in other words, again, this is all coming to this horribly interconnected network of we call it the swamp now, but this horribly networked situation with mob bosses, anti-Castro Cubans, CIA assassins, and a big global corporation that no one can figure out exactly what it does. All it says it's doing is it's operating hotels and casinos and a bunch of other stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's tied as kind of the parent umbrella company to all these world trade centers. Okay? Mm-hmm. And let that connection sink in for a moment with 9/11. Mm-hmm. Because all of this, again, is going back to the CIA. So yeah, if you're Garrison, you're just kind of scratching your head. This is gigantic. And you can sense at times when you watch him on TV outlining all these connections, you can sense his own discomfort at times that this is huge. Mm-hmm. And, the Kennedy assassination is just kind of the little tip of the iceberg on all of this networked corruption. So, yeah, the Torbett document is immensely important. And in my book, I point out that Permindex could easily be taken in two ways as the shorthand for permanent industrial expositions, but as Garrison's uncovering, this is connected to assassination activity. So it's a permanent index. It's your hit list, quite literally, of, this person needs to be taken out and that person.
It's an index of people to assassinate.
Yes.
Fascinating. Wow.
And what's worse is, as he's investigating this Centro Mondiale Commerciale in Italy and its associations to Permindex, lo and behold, the people he discovers on the board are kind of a fascist who's who. Because you have the former Italian agricultural minister under Mussolini, another nice guy that's hovering on the edges here. You have a fascist agriculture minister from Italy. You have one of the former fascist premiers of Hungary, Ferenc Nagy, is on the board of Permindex. And many people think Ferenc Nagy is the umbrella man in Dallas. Okay,
right.
This doesn't get more bizarre. You have all these fascists on the board of this thing. And so, you're Jim Garrison there in New Orleans, and you're thinking, my word, what are all these fascists doing with this Permindex thing? I'll be blunt and say the way it looks to me is, this is a CIA cutout of some sort, but it's also a cutout for General Galen, because he's certainly connected with all these people.
Right. And he's over there.
He's over there.
Yeah. It's easier access.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah. So Garrison, he's starting off with the strange anomalies around the JFK assassination, and he finds himself bumping up against this shadow structure. And that shadow structure, as soon as they realize that he's kind of a loose cannon, they try to really do the clamp down. They try to ruin his reputation in the media, and that goes on even to this day.
Yes. Yeah. It's very interesting to make the comparison between the media now and the way they're behaving, and I'm using that term very loosely, and Jim Garrison. Because for one thing, I think it was NBC News that ran a hit piece as the Garrison investigations were going on, ran a hit piece against Garrison that was narrated by the NBC reporter Walter Sullivan.
All right.
Well, dig around long enough, and Garrison demanded that they give him equal time to respond, which they did. You can actually go on YouTube and see the original program and see Garrison's response.
That's a good response, too.
Yeah, it was. It was, they didn't give him equal time. They gave him half equal time, but he managed to, lay out the basic nuts and bolts of his case. But it turns out that Walter Sullivan, if I remember correctly, at some point, some assassination researcher, I forget who it may have been, uncovered the fact that Sullivan may have been part of the CIA's Operation Mockingbird. And if you don't know what Operation Mockingbird is, it was the CIA program to infiltrate the then three major television networks and various important newspapers like the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on and so forth, with their people to make sure that, number one, no story appeared that would be embarrassing to the agency, and number two, to control whatever narrative that the CIA wanted to control. So there are these little indications that even the hit pieces against Garrison are being more or less orchestrated by the CIA. And then the other thing that they did was they would send him false informants with information just too good to be true. And Garrison was actually caught by one of these guys that he actually put on the stand during the Shaw trial. And the guy, I forget what his name was, Gordon something or other, and he completely changed the story
Mm-hmm.
on the stand that he had initially told Garrison and his researchers.
He hurt the case, yeah.
He hurt the case dramatically. And it shows in the way that the jury reacted to the trial, because they acquitted Shaw, but when they were polled as to what they thought about the assassination itself, the jurors unanimously agreed that Garrison had made the case that there was some sort of conspiracy there.
Mm-hmm.
He just had not established, to their satisfaction, that Shaw was involved. So yeah, Garrison did manage to shake all of that loose. I think the Garrison investigation is pivotal here, Daniel, because prior to the Garrison investigation, you had a few assassination researchers here and there, Mark Lane being the most prominent, but people like Harold Weiss and so on, these early Warren Commission skeptics, but they weren't paid that much attention to until after the Garrison trial.
Right.
That's when that created the critical mass, I think, for skepticism regarding the Warren report. So Garrison is crucial. And what's interesting here, as you say, is the files are now redacted that they're releasing. Well, what does that tell you?
Mm-hmm.
If the FBI and the CIA are going to President Trump saying, we need more time, please, don't release these documents.
Right.
Well, that means, we need more time to airbrush out of this whole picture things that could tend to incriminate us. But even still, what has been released is incriminating enough.
Mm-hmm. There's no question.
There's no question, because what has been released, essentially, as far as I can tell, is verifying the basic outline that assassination researchers came up with on their own.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which kudos to all of them, beginning with Harold Weiss and Mark Lane till today.
Absolutely. There's an interesting little addendum to all that, which is Garrison in 1968. He phones up the editor of Ramparts magazine.
Yes.
And he talks to Norman Hinkle, and he says, "Oh, we had it all wrong about the role of the Texas oilmen. Actually, what they were doing were working around this area of aerospace, and it was the people, it's the military-industrial complex element associated with aerospace that's responsible for the assassination." Now, we know that he dug into Boeing, and we know that he dug into these companies. What was he getting at there, though? He was finding out something about aerospace being involved with the Kennedy assassination.
You want to know what I really think? And I'm going to have to crawl out onto the twig of speculation here. In the Torbett document, there is mention of Werner von Braun being in charge of an agency that I have never been able to verify existed, called DISC, Defense Industrial Security Command, acronym DISC, D-I-S-C.
Right.
Which is, that's an eye grabber. And let me mention something about the Torbett document that people don't know. The man that compiled the Torbett document was an attorney in southern Texas, around the Far McAllen area, way down at the southern tip of Texas, that had been involved with the Johnson machine in Texas and had been involved with Garrison's investigation. So the Torbett document is supposedly kind of his summary of all the vast amount of research that Garrison had uncovered. We do know for a fact that Garrison did uncover this weird connection of all of these NASA employees that came from the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans. How do you go from working for a coffee company to working for NASA? Explain that one to me.
You're right.
So you do have some context here for the speculation that I'm about to offer about the oilmen and aerospace, military intelligence, and so on being involved with the assassination. The context here is what happens, and I even hate to mention this in this context. People are going to think This guy is nuts. Lock him in a padded room. But I can assure you the research is there. You just have to be willing to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
After Roswell, yes, I mentioned that name. After Roswell, something very funny happens inside of the U.S. Army and inside of NASA.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Army counterintelligence people reopened the case, the security vetting case for one of these paperclip Nazis that was part of von Braun's team by the name of Dr. Curt Davis. They reopened his case. And the reason, in part, that they did so was that by that time, the Army had noticed that these paperclip Nazis that are there in El Paso at Fort Bliss and scattered throughout New Mexico and all of our super secret defense installations appear to be exhibiting two patterns of behavior that make no sense. Number one, they're all driving nice, big, expensive Mercedes cars. In other words, they're living a lifestyle beyond the salaries that they're being paid by NASA and the U.S. Army. So where's the money coming from for all of these Nazis? And number two, even more importantly, since they're in El Paso, they make lots of trips across the border into Mexico. Mm-hmm. And they appear, according to the U.S. Army counterintelligence, they appear to have dead drops, mail drops, and the Army's noticing, gee, they've still got the same chain of command that they had over there in Nazi Germany. And they appear to be getting instructions from somewhere. You know, the famous incident to me was Strugholt and von Braun firing off missiles, one of which they targeted for Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. So, you know, the United States is launching V2s at Mexico.
Wow.
And, you know, this creates an international incident that most people have forgotten about because, you know, the Mexican government, as you might imagine, objects to being fired.
Targeted, yes.
Targeted by Nazis that are working for you. So, and, you know, there's a third thing that's going on in the middle of all this. Some V2s, they put cameras and film cameras in the nose cones of these V2s that they're shooting off in Mexico. And of course, as the nose cone is re-entering, it's taking pictures of our installations. And the Army goes out to recover the cameras and the film, and gee, guess what? They're missing.
Oh.
You know? So,
wow.
You be Army intelligence here. What do you think is going on? So, yeah, they reopened the investigation on some of these Nazis, one of whom is Curt Davis. Now, what that's telling me, this goes back to Kennedy, what that's telling me, and what it was telling the U.S. Army at the time, is these, to be country simple about it, these damned Krauts are doing their own thing. Mm-hmm. They're running their own show, and we're just footing the bill for it. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's an aspect of this involvement with JFK because of that. They're looking at a threat from him to their status and standing. And there's one final thing to note here. The fellow that the U.S. Army that reopened the security vetting case, Curt Davis, this guy, you know, I hate to say this about somebody dead, even a Nazi that's not here to defend himself, but this guy just strikes me as a real piece of work. Because, number one, he's not a rocket scientist at all. He's a plasma physicist. He's a high voltage electricity and tension physicist. Rockets ain't his bag.
All right.
Guess where he ends up? Well, lo and behold, he ends up as, number one, the senior flight director at Cape Canaveral during Apollo.
Oh.
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 In other words, this Kraut ends up as such a seniorly placed member of NASA that he's got his hands in all the administrative pies, coupled with the actual operational management of the Apollo program. That's number one. Number two, he ends up, by the time he retires from NASA in 1983, he ends up being the guy that all of NASA's UFO files get funneled to.
Oh.
Oh.
Wow.
Wow. Number three, he was one of the Nazi scientists working on the Bell Project with Hermann Oberth. Number four, when he retires, he then goes on to the board of a company called OTRAG, ORTAG, which stands for Orbital Raketen- und Transport Aktionsgesellschaft, which of course is a German firm.
Mm-hmm.
But what is OTRAG really doing? Well, it turns out, if Mikhail Gorbachev is to be believed, it turns out that OTRAG was given 250,000 square miles in the middle of the Congo for a secret compound that was developing cruise missiles and rockets and biological weapons and so on and so forth. This from Gorbachev, by the way.
Wow.
So in other words, it looks to me like Davis was was up to all of his old tricks at that time.
All right.
Running essentially a private Area 51 in the middle of Africa for this German company.
Wow.
So yeah, is there possibly here a military intelligence aerospace connection to the JFK assassination? Yeah, you betcha there is. and here's the thing, I'm mentioning Curt Davis because all of this activity is there in the files. So I'm thinking, in answer to your Garrison question, Garrison's got a pretty top-notch investigative team. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to bet a little money and say that he probably ran across some of this stuff, going on, beginning with Roswell and carrying on through NASA mm-hmm. with this Curt Davis guy. And the other thing we need to remember is at the time of the Kennedy assassination, you just have, this is priceless. You'll love this. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, Daniel, the Germans were so fed up with the American procurement and contract process. They want to build this big honking rocket.
Right.
They were so fed up with the delays and inefficiency of the American contract process that Arthur Rudolph seriously proposed, well, let's just build it ourselves in-house. In other words, and James Webb, Kennedy's
yes.
NASA director, had to close that project down because the Germans just wanted to build the Saturn V themselves.
Oh, that's disturbing.
And we couldn't have that. This has got to be good old American know-how.
Right. Right.
So we can't have that.
They were ready to roll.
Yeah, they were ready to roll, So you've got this going on, and this happens prior to the Kennedy assassination. So yeah, this is going to get back to President Kennedy. Hey, these Nazis, they want to jump the gun and build this dang rocket themselves. So yeah, Kennedy, every action he takes is going to piss off these people. Whether they're the Nazis, working for the CIA, whether they're Galen's group, whether they're these NASA Nazis that are connected to the Texas oilmen there in Fort Worth, the whole TRW thing. Everything Kennedy does is pissing these people off.
And he has the ability to do that because unlike, say, Nixon, he's not beholden to all these interests when he comes in.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo. His family's independently wealthy. His family is connected to both sides of the political aisle. I mean, my word, Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
You can't get more right wing than that. He's coming in to power as quite literally the leader of a dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the Kennedy family and what happened after his assassination. Well, you had his brother, former Attorney General, assassinated, and then you had, I think, several attempts on Teddy Kennedy. You had that airplane accident where his back was broken.
Yes.
Remember that? And that was shortly, if I remember correctly,
64. Yeah.
Yeah, 64. And then the whole Chappaquiddick thing, which to me, and I don't get me wrong, I'm not a Teddy Kennedy fan, but to me that whole thing always had the air or feel of they were trying to set him up.
Mm-hmm.
And bring him into line, which it certainly did.
No question. When he ran for president, that's the issue that sunk him.
That's the issue that sunk him, but also he changes his domestic political views radically. As he had been adamantly anti-abortion. All of a sudden, he becomes vehemently pro-choice. He had been kind of conservative with some of his fiscal ideas, and then becomes this
super tax and spender.
This super liberal progressive. So you're looking at a dynasty, and it's interesting that in the Kennedy film output, there's a very interesting film that predates Oliver Stone by a couple of decades, called Executive Action. It has Burt Lancaster is in it.
Right.
Yeah, you've seen this.
Yes,
well,
absolutely.
Will
Fascinating.
Geer.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating film because it starts off with somebody giving a presentation, Lancaster, to a bunch of Texas oil men about the Kennedys are setting up a dynasty, and we got to take care of this now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Will Geer, Grandpa Will, the rich oil man, giving the final go ahead, take him out.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, the screenplay for that film was by Dalton Trumbo, which took, I imagine, some guts for him to do, because he was one of the people fingered by McCarthy, who's friends with Kennedy.
Right. Yeah.
So, on and on these connections go. But
you're right, though. It proves it, because when Robert ran, he basically was going to take the presidency. Yeah. And then Teddy would have been very easily the next 10 years or so. Sure.
Oh, so absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Kennedy, if he had had a second term, puts him to 68. Robert comes in 68 to 76, and then Teddy from 76 to 84. So you've got that whole period.
It would have been like FDR reincarnated.
Infinitely more so.
Yeah.
Infinitely more so. Because you've got a total of 6 terms that, the Kennedys can shape the country as they will.
Right.
And you have to stop and think about what this would have avoided. It would have avoided Nixon, Watergate,
Vietnam,
Reagan, and the assassination, all of that. It would have completely changed the complexion of the country.
No room in there for Bush to work his
magic. No room in there for Bush.
Yeah.
That family's power is directly threatened by Kennedy's actions or planned actions against the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with the Bush connections by Prescott Bush to Fritz Thiessen and again the Nazis, that could all have come out in the wash much earlier than it actually did. So it's hugely significant. The way I look at it, Daniel, is I'm with Oliver Stone here. I think the Kennedy assassination was a coup d'etat, and it begins a long arc of American history that really only climaxes or reaches its conclusion with 9/11.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, that puts you and Professor Scott in the same line of thinking. We come to the conclusions by different roads. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It is interesting, and just one little aside here about JFK. Coming into power, independent, an idea of freedom, an idea of change, And this whole apparatus that's there, at least since the World War II, probably even before that, but that whole apparatus is there. That national security structure, national security state is there. And he comes in thinking, I can change this around, I can modernize it, I can make it work. And they're just looking at him and thinking, we can get rid of him and end our nightmare.
Yes.
And get on with our projects. So it's kind of fascinating, Kennedy upsetting the status quo there, because he's running into almost these timeless issues, which is the exotic technology aspect, the aspect of freedom, the confronting the deep state, so he's right in there with all these things. And so he's this pivotal figure coming in, and they're looking at him for a while and sizing him up and thinking, what are we going to do with him? And I'm pretty sure, if we're just to speculate for a moment, their plans to eliminate him kind of start immediately when he gets in.
I think that's probably true. I think there is even a possibility that they're thinking this before he gets in as a backup plan should he get the election. Remember, they were expecting Nixon to win.
Yeah.
Nixon's their guy. And the mob hands Cook County to Kennedy, and that tilted the election. And Nixon, oddly enough, doesn't press the point. He could have created quite a stir and contested the election, but he doesn't. I think they were looking at Kennedy long before all of this. The connection to McCarthy being one thing, because had McCarthy kept at it, it would have eventually uncovered this network. And I think that's what they also, I go back to what I've said before on your shows about the committee era. You've got all of these weird committees all of a sudden popping up out of nowhere after the end of World War II. McCarthy's only the most infamous of them. You've got other investigative committees, which the Kennedys are also connected to, oddly enough.
Yeah, right. They're right in the thick of them. The Covert Committee is one of the
Covert Committee is absolutely a key committee here. The whole investigation of the mob thing. So, they're placed on all these committees, or they have associations with them. And I'm thinking that the Kennedys are probably aware enough of the real origins of this deep state way back with Woodrow Wilson, Federal Reserve Act and so on and so forth, because what's one of the things that John Kennedy does? Well, I'm going to print $4 billion worth of United States notes and completely bypass the Federal Reserve. I remember spending those as a kid,
yes.
The little red seals on the dollar bills. So
the message is, I don't have to play by your rules.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not going to.
Yeah. And a lot of enmity there with David Rockefeller.
Huge amount of enmity. I think David Talbot and the book, The Devil's Chessboard, has really kind of cinched and nailed that case.
Yeah.
And again, Kennedy's Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon, I think... I absolutely think is kind of a key, crucial liaison here between that network around Dulles and then the Rockefeller interest. So yeah, it's very complex. It's very interconnected, and I don't think that Kennedy. Well, let's put it this way. I think if you view Kennedy as just kind of a maverick shooting from the hip as situations arise, is completely the wrong picture of the man. He's taking calculated risks. And he knows the basic outlines of this deep state structure. Because again, I really do think Eisenhower probably clued him in privately about a lot of this stuff. And certainly the Truman connection is there. The financial connections are there with his father to know a lot of this stuff.
Right. And he has to find some way when he gets in to tame this out of control machine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's fascinating because There is one odd element hanging out there from the Garrison side, which is Guy Bannister.
Yeah.
So
I'm waiting for you to say it. I've already crawled out enough onto the end of the twig. I'll let you do it this time.
Well, Guy Bannister goes as far out. Well, let's do the simple version first. Guy Bannister is a right-wing ex-FBI chief.
Somewhat to the right of Attila the Hun, yes. Go ahead.
He's in New Orleans suddenly as a private investigator.
Yeah.
By the way, he does an event with Douglas Caddy as a kind of a youth for conservatives at Caddy's high school. Which
join the Minutemen militia thing, sort of thing that's going on back then.
Well, just to blow both our minds, there's a certain point in time where Lee Oswald, Douglas Caddy, and Guy Bannister are all within about a 6-block radius of each other.
Oh dear. Well, it's kind of like that scene from Stone's JFK. You know, you've got Garrison down there saying, "Well, that's the ONI,
right.
That's the FBI, and that's the CIA."
And in the middle of it is this guy handing out.
In the middle of it is Guy Bannister. All right, well, Guy Bannister, yeah. I'm glad you brought him up because I totally forgot about him. Guy Bannister, if you don't know, he is so weird in all of this. He's the FBI special agent in charge of the Boise, Idaho FBI office in 1947. Okay, now why is that important? Because when Kenneth Arnold, the famous guy that has his UFO sighting when he's flying his airplane close to Mount Rainier in Washington, he sees these, what he describes as discs kind of skipping along like pebbles that you skip on the water. And then he later draws a picture of what he sees, and it's not a disc, it's actually kind of a flying wing that looks oddly kind of like the Horton flying wing.
Right.
And so, Arnold makes his report, and the reports are picked up by the FBI, and Guy Bannister, there in Boise, is passing on these UFO reports to FBI headquarters, and at the bottom of his reports, the filing category is subject matter X. So in other words, there's the beginning of the X-Files with Guy Bannister. So he ends up, as you say, in New Orleans, this guy that filed all these UFO reports. He ends up in New Orleans as a private detective at 544 Lafayette Street, I think it was.
It's Camp Street, yes.
Camp Street,
Lafayette, right.
Lafayette is the Fair Play for Cuba thing that Oswald is, and it's the same.
It's the other side of the building.
Yeah, it's just a different door. So you're Garrison, and you're looking at this. What is this guy doing here? And, what's his connection to Oswald? And at one point, Garrison's people uncover one of these Fair Play for Cuba bulletins that Oswald was handing out, and he had stamped the address 544 Camp Street. In other words, he had given them Bannister's address on his Fair Play for Cuba committee. So in other words,
and only once.
And only once. Yeah.
Wow, what a mistake there.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And Garrison begins to suspect that Bannister is really running some sort of front operation for the CIA. Well, it turns out, yeah, he was, because he's also connected with these anti-Castro Cubans that are training in the swamps and marshes around New Orleans. And Oswald is seen in their company on certain occasions. So yeah, the whole thing turns out to be yet another weird connection to UFOs, Oswald, anti-Castro Cubans, the CIA.
Fascinating. He's connected. This is the amazing thing. Bannister's connected to the UFO file.
Yeah, exactly.
There are field reports and newspaper articles with him uncovering, different things that were identified as discs that turned out, not quite to be what they thought. But he's out there investigating cases, and people are, the press is following him around. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And, it's yet another little indicator that there's some aspect of exotic technology, counterintelligence, UFO intelligence connected to this whole Kennedy thing. Beyond the Texas oil men and beyond all these Nazis in NASA, you've got this.
Mm-hmm.
And that statement in the UFO files that Kennedy wants, to vet all of them and turn over what we can to the Soviets. To me, what that's indicating is Kennedy knows that something is up with UFOs, and we're not being given the complete picture. And most likely the Soviets are investigating this. Maybe I can kick some information loose if we turn this into a genuinely international investigation. I think probably that was part of his reasoning, because this whole idea of a joint moon mission with the Soviets, to offer something like that, you're going to have to share technology. You're going to have to share information.
All right.
And certainly both countries are thinking, okay, we go out there. What if we encounter somebody? What's our intelligence on them? So I'm thinking maybe this may have been a factor that played into his process of reasoning.
It's a united front.
It's a united front, exactly.
He's saying we need their intelligence just as much as they're going to need ours to deal with this.
Right, exactly. And
it's interesting because Gorbachev recently came out at this New York Press Club, and Kissinger and people like that were in the audience, and they were going through with George Shultz about the regular stuff, about how did you reduce nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev stops, goes off script, and says, in Reykjavik, when we were alone, Reagan pulled me aside and looked in my eyes and said, if there's an alien attack, will you help us out? And he said, of course I will. And Reagan said, good, we'll help you too.
Uh-huh.
The whole room drops and everybody's
I'm sure that this is like...
and this is Charlie Rose before the sex scandal, okay?
Well, yeah, maybe that was related to something else other than Trump.
Yes, exactly. But it is amazing because there's that thing again where here's a president, in Reagan's case, trying to get the Soviets on board with him to deal with the alien invasion idea.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is there. It's this thread between those two presidencies.
It's there, and it's deeply buried. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that. I had not heard that. But it makes sense to me because, it was during the Gorbachev era that the Soviet Union began releasing a lot of information about its own UFO studies. And, what came out was just kind of jaw-dropping, what they had been dealing with.
Yeah.
It was during that era that we learned that UFO incident that had actually started the launch sequence in Soviet missiles, and left the Russians trying to shut the thing down,
This is one of the things that Kennedy was trying to avoid, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly.
Knowns and unknowns.
And, the other thing that kind of corroborates is the take of Colonel Corso in his book, The Day After Roswell, what, everybody now dismisses. I don't think you can do that with his book all that easily, because one of the things he points out is that the whole hidden purpose of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction was precisely to just be able to overwhelm any alien invader with so many thermonuclear warheads that, invasion wasn't an option.
Uh-huh.
So, if we got invaded, the Soviets would, nuke the daylights out of them, and vice versa. And, that little comment from Gorbachev seems to indicate that, yeah, maybe that was in play there.
Absolutely. Joseph, amazing insight. Of course, your book on this subject, LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill JFK, a coalescence of interests, just a fascinating read, going really deep. And I also recommend another one of yours in relation to this, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, both available at GizaDeathStar.com. Now, in part 3, we need to go even deeper into what Permindex grew into and how the Russians handled the UFO file. And what are we looking at with the Space Force, really? Now, subscribers will get this very special episode in their inbox next week, and now is the perfect time to subscribe at darkjournalist.com. And remember to join us live next Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern for a new episode of the X series that tracks this hidden exotic technology. Thank you for joining me for this special episode on the roots of the secret space program with Dr. Joseph Farrell. You can find more special reports, deep interviews, and documentaries by going to darkjournalist.com. You can also subscribe here to our YouTube channel to receive the latest videos. See you soon.